The wooden door swung open with barely a sound, revealing shelves packed with provisions and warm amber light spilling from a room that no one knew existed. Outside, the blizzard of 1861 screamed across the Montana mountains with winds cold enough to kill a man in minutes. But inside that hidden 8x8 refuge, Reese Cade sat comfortably by a fire no larger than a supper flame, knowing he had built the one thing that could outlast the storm. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of wilderness survival is even more impossible than this one. The year was 1859. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was in its twilight years, but men who knew the mountains could still make a living if they were willing to risk everything. Reese Cade was one of those men. He had survived 6 winters trapping beaver along the tributaries that fed into the Yellowstone River, working territory in what would later become southwestern Montana. He was 32 years old, lean from years of physical labor, and possessed the kind of quiet competence that kept a man alive in country that killed careless trappers with brutal regularity. Reese had partnered that season with Knox Dane, a trapper from Pennsylvania who had come west 4 years earlier. They made a good team. Knox was methodical about checking trap lines. Reese was skilled at reading weather and animal patterns. They had established a camp near a series of beaver ponds, building a cabin using methods that every mountain man knew. Cut logs from nearby timber, notch them at the corners so they stacked and interlocked, pack the gaps between logs with moss and mud to keep out wind, build a simple door from planks held together with cross pieces, cover the roof with poles and bark. The entire structure took them 5 days to complete working together. It was a serviceable cabin. It kept out most of the wind and rain. It provided shelter from the elements, which was all most trappers needed or expected. The door hung on leather hinges and could be barred from inside with a wooden beam. One small window covered with scraped rawhide let in dim light during the day. A fire pit in the center provided heat and cooking capability, with smoke escaping through a gap left in the roof structure. The dirt floor stayed cold, but that was normal. You slept on raised platforms covered with furs and blankets. Their trap lines extended several miles in different directions from the cabin, following the creeks and beaver ponds where the animals built their dams. Every morning, one or both of them would walk the lines, checking for catches, resetting traps, processing any pelts. It was repetitive work, cold and wet much of the time, but profitable when the trapping was good. They had pulled nearly 80 pelts by mid-April, enough to make the season worthwhile if they could finish. Strong before heading to St. Louis to sell, Reese had learned over his years in the mountains that survival came down to routine and caution. Check your traps methodically, keep your powder dry. Watch for signs of grizzly activity and give the animals wide berth when possible. Maintain your equipment. Stock enough supplies to outlast unexpected weather. Most men who died in the mountains died because they broke one of these simple rules or because they encountered bad luck at the wrong moment. On the morning of April 14th, Knox left the cabin alone to check the northern trap line, while Reese stayed behind to process pelts from the previous day's haul. Knox had been gone 3 hours when Reese heard the gunfire. 3 rapid shots from the direction of the northern creek, then silence. Reese grabbed his rifle and headed toward the sound, moving fast but staying alert. Gunfire in the mountains meant trouble. It could mean Knox had encountered hostiles or an animal or had some other emergency that required help. He found Knox 1.5 miles from the cabin, near a beaver dam where they had set 4 traps 2 days earlier. A grizzly bear had killed him. The signs were clear in the torn earth and blood. Knox had been checking a trap when the bear attacked, probably a female protecting cubs nearby. He had managed to fire his rifle, but the shot had only wounded the animal. The enraged grizzly had killed Knox with terrible speed and efficiency. The bear was gone by the time Reese arrived. Knox's body lay beside the creek, his rifle 10 feet away where it had fallen. Reese checked for any sign of life, even though he knew there would be none. Knox had died quickly. which was the only mercy in the situation. Reese carried Knox's body back to camp. It took 2 trips, one to retrieve Knox and another to gather his rifle and equipment. He buried his partner on a hillside overlooking the creek valley, digging the grave by hand and marking it with stones stacked in a cairn. He spoke no words over the grave. Knox had not been a religious man, and Reese did not know what words would have been appropriate anyway. That night, Reese sat in the cabin, unable to sleep. The reality of what had happened kept replaying in his mind. Knox had been experienced, careful, and competent. He had done nothing wrong. The bear had simply been there at the wrong moment, and Knox had paid with his life. That was the nature of the mountains. You could do everything right and still die because of circumstances beyond your control. But something else occupied Reese's thoughts as the night wore on. He kept thinking about the cabin itself, about how little protection it actually offered. If a grizzly decided to get inside, there was nothing stopping it. The door would not hold. The logs had gaps where determined claws could widen openings. The rawhide window could be torn through in seconds. He sat there in the darkness, listening to the wind outside, and realized something that would change the next 2 years of his life. Every mountain man accepted the danger of working trap lines in grizzly country. That risk was unavoidable. But the cabin, the one place that should offer safety and protection, was effectively useless against a determined animal. Most trappers accepted this as simply how things were. Reese Cade could not accept it. Not anymore. Not after carrying Knox's body back from that creek and burying him on a hillside. Reese finished the spring trapping season alone. He completed the trap lines that he and Knox had established, processed the remaining pelts, and prepared for the journey to St. Louis. But during those weeks, his attention had shifted. He found himself studying the cabin with new eyes, seeing all its vulnerabilities. He noticed how wind pushed through gaps in the chinking. He observed how easily the door could be forced if something strong enough decided to push. He recognized that the structure he lived in offered the illusion of protection rather than actual security. Before leaving for St. Louis in early June, Reese visited other trappers' camps scattered throughout the region. He told them he was checking in after Knox's death, which was true enough, but his real purpose was different. He examined their cabins carefully. He asked questions about encounters with bears and other threats. He listened to stories of cabins that had been broken into by animals or damaged by weather. A pattern emerged from these conversations. Grizzlies tested structures methodically. They pushed on doors first, knowing from experience that doors were often the weakest point. They attacked corners second, where notched log construction created natural leverage points. They widened any gaps they found in chinking, using their remarkable strength to tear through moss and mud. Several trappers described returning to their cabins to find doors torn off hinges or corners partially demolished where bears had gained entry. The journey to St. Louis took 3 weeks. Reese sold his pelts for decent profit, but instead of spending his earnings on the usual whiskey and entertainment, he spent 2 weeks studying buildings in the city. He watched carpenters working on warehouse construction, paying close attention to how they reinforced door frames and corners. He examined brick buildings, noting how the interlocking pattern created strength through distribution of weight. He studied stone foundations and how they prevented settling and shifting. People thought his behavior was strange. Mountain men did not typically spend their time in civilization examining construction techniques with the focus of an apprentice. But Reese was learning principles that few trappers understood. He was discovering that structural strength came from eliminating weak points and distributing force across multiple connection points rather than concentrating stress at individual joints. He purchased supplies that reflected his new understanding: 40 pounds of square-cut nails, iron reinforcement plates, heavy metal hinges that weighed 10 pounds each, a specialized draw knife for shaping wood. Other trappers saw his purchases and asked questions. Why spend money on expensive hardware when leather and wooden pegs worked adequately. Why buy tools for fine carpentry when rough construction was sufficient for mountain cabins? Reese offered no detailed explanations. He simply said he was planning to build a better cabin. The other trappers nodded and wished him well, but he could see the skepticism in their expressions. Better cabin meant wasted effort in their minds. A cabin either kept out wind and rain, or it did not. Anything beyond that was unnecessary luxury. Reese returned to the mountains in late July of 1859 with his supplies and a plan that existed only in his mind. He did not return to the cabin he had shared with Knox. That structure held too many memories, and more practically, it was built in the standard way he now intended to reject completely. Instead, he selected a new location 3 miles upstream, on high ground above the creek with clear sight lines in all directions. The location was unusual by trapping standards. Most mountain men built near water for convenience. Reese chose elevation and visibility over easy access to the creek. His reasoning was simple. If threats approached, whether animal or human, he wanted to see them coming. If heavy rain created flooding, he wanted his structure above the water line. The inconvenience of hauling water 50 yards uphill was acceptable compared to the advantages the location provided. Other trappers visited his new site in August and asked questions about his plans. Reese explained he was building a cabin using reinforced construction techniques. He described some of his ideas: better corner joints, superior chinking, a door that could withstand serious force. The trappers listened politely, but their skepticism was obvious. Jude Flint, who trapped territory 10 miles south, was particularly direct in his assessment. A cabin took 4 or 5 days to build, with 2 men working. Why would anyone spend weeks or months on construction when that time could be spent trapping? The purpose of a cabin was shelter from weather. Anything beyond basic structure was wasted effort that did not increase the number of pelts you could take in a season. Cole Stark, another trapper who worked the region, pointed out the cost issue. Iron hardware was expensive on the frontier. The metal reinforcement plates and heavy hinges Reese had purchased represented significant money. That investment bought no additional furs and provided no obvious benefit over standard leather hinges and wooden construction. Reese did not argue with them. He understood their perspective. From a pure economic standpoint, their logic made sense. Time spent building elaborate structures was time not spent working trap lines. Money spent on expensive hardware was money that could have been saved or invested in additional traps and supplies. But Reese was solving a different problem than the one his fellow trappers focused on. They optimized for maximum pelts per season. Reese was optimizing for survival itself. He had carried Knox's body back from that creek and buried him on a hillside. He had spent a night in a cabin that offered no real protection, realizing that the structure he trusted with his life was effectively useless against determined threats. That experience had changed his priorities in ways the other trappers could not understand without experiencing similar loss. He simply told them he wanted to build something better. They shook their heads at the foolishness but wished him well. When they left, Reese began the real work. Reese began by digging. The location he had chosen sat against a natural hillside, which allowed him to excavate a room that would be partially underground and partially backed by earth. He dug for 2 weeks straight, removing soil and rock to create a space 8 feet square and 7 feet deep. The dimensions were deliberate. A small room required less heat to maintain comfortable temperature. Every additional foot of space meant exponentially more firewood needed to stay warm. He excavated the hillside carefully, creating a room that extended into the slope, rather than being fully underground. This gave him an earth backing on 3 sides while leaving the front open for the entrance he would construct. The earth itself would provide insulation. Ground temperature remained relatively stable, even during harsh winters, typically around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, several feet below the surface. A room surrounded by earth would benefit from that thermal stability. The floor presented its own challenge. Reese wanted something that would not become muddy, but would still provide insulation value. He hauled sand from the creek bed, mixing it with clay and tamping it down in layers until he had created a packed surface that was nearly as hard as stone. The process took 4 days. The result was a floor that would stay dry, would not freeze solid in winter, and would provide additional thermal mass to help regulate temperature. For the ceiling and interior walls, he cut logs and shaped them flat on one side using his draw knife. This created smooth interior surfaces rather than the rounded log faces of standard cabin construction. The flat surfaces fit together with minimal gaps, reducing drafts. He mortared the joints with a mixture of clay and pine resin, creating seals that would remain flexible in cold weather while keeping out wind. Inside the small room, he built storage directly into the structure. Wooden pegs driven into the walls at ceiling height would hold hanging meat. Shelves, constructed from split planks, would store preserved goods. Along one wall, he created a firewood storage area where he could stack enough fuel to last weeks without needing to venture outside. A small fire pit in the corner included a narrow chimney that vented through the hillside, too small for anything to enter, but adequate for smoke escape. The room took shape slowly. By late September, he had created a space that was sealed, insulated, and designed for long-term occupation by a single person. It was small enough to heat efficiently, but large enough to live in comfortably. It had storage for provisions, ventilation for fire, and earth backing for thermal stability. Other trappers who visited during construction were baffled. Why dig a hole in the ground attached to your cabin? Root cellars were built separate from living structures and were meant to stay cold for food preservation. This room appeared too warm for proper storage, but too small for comfortable living. What purpose did it serve? Reese explained it was additional storage space. They accepted this explanation, though they clearly thought it was unnecessary effort. The door was where Reese invested the most time and thought. Standard cabin doors were simple constructions. Planks held together with cross pieces hung on leather hinges or wooden pegs. They kept out wind adequately and could be barred from inside. That was sufficient for most purposes. Reese needed something entirely different. He started with planks hewn from a single massive pine tree, selecting wood with the straightest grain and densest growth rings he could find. Each plank was shaped to 3 inches thick and fitted so precisely that light could not pass between them when assembled. He used tongue and groove joinery, cutting a groove along one edge of each plank and a matching protrusion on the other. When assembled, they interlocked to create what was effectively a single, solid piece. The exterior face of the door was smooth and unremarkable. It looked like a heavy wooden panel, nothing more. But on the interior face, Reese built something unprecedented. He constructed shelving directly into the door itself, creating 5 horizontal shelves that would only be visible when the door was opened. The shelves were integral to the door structure, not attached afterwards. Each shelf was deep enough to hold folded blankets, preserved goods in jars, metal containers, and other supplies. The engineering purpose of these shelves was twofold. First, they would hold provisions that served as insulation. Wool blankets trapped air and created thermal barriers. Jars and containers created additional air gaps that reduced heat transfer. Second, the weight of the stored goods would help create a compression seal when the door closed. A door weighing 300 pounds loaded with supplies would press firmly against its frame, eliminating gaps that lighter doors could not prevent. The metal reinforcement plate was critical to the entire system. Reese mounted it on the exterior face where the door would need structural support to handle the extreme weight. The plate was not decorative. It served as the mounting point for hinges that were bolted completely through the door and into the log frame. These were not surface-mounted hinges that could be torn free. They were integrated into the structural logs themselves, mortised into pockets cut specifically to receive them. The plate also housed the locking mechanism. Reese designed a heavy wooden beam that slid horizontally through iron brackets, connecting the door directly to the adjacent wall when engaged. To open the door from outside with the lock engaged would require destroying the wall itself. He added a small covered slot that allowed him to operate the lock from outside if he knew where it was and how it worked, but to anyone else, the door would appear to have no exterior access at all. The door took 3 weeks to build and install. When finished, it appeared from the main cabin side to be nothing more than a heavy wooden panel, no visible shelves, no obvious storage. The winter of 1859 to 1860 gave Reese his first opportunity to test the system. He stocked the hidden room methodically before the first serious snowfall. Firewood filled the storage area he had built along one wall, enough to last 6 weeks without resupply. Smoked venison and elk hung from the ceiling pegs. Preserved vegetables in jars lined the interior shelves. Water containers held enough liquid to last 2 weeks. Everything he might need was stored inside the sealed space. He tested the door's thermal barrier properties by monitoring temperature differences. On nights when the main cabin dropped to near freezing despite a fire in the central pit, he measured the temperature inside the hidden room. With no fire at all, the earth-backed space maintained 48 to 52 degrees simply from ground temperature stability. With a small fire no larger than what you would use for cooking, the temperature rose to a comfortable 60 degrees and stayed there for hours after the fire died. The firewood efficiency was remarkable. In the main cabin, he burned through an armload of wood every 2 hours to maintain barely adequate warmth. In the hidden room, a single armload lasted 8 to 10 hours and produced superior comfort. The difference came from the combination of small, sealed volume, earth insulation, and the heavy door, with its hidden shelves loaded with goods that created multiple insulation layers. Jude Flint visited in January and saw the completed structure for the first time. He examined the heavy door with obvious confusion. Why build something so substantial for what appeared to be a storage closet? The door's exterior face showed no indication of the shelving on the interior or the room beyond. It simply looked like an extremely heavy wooden panel reinforced with an expensive metal plate. Reese explained he wanted security for his supplies. Jude accepted this but pointed out the obvious problem. The door probably weighed 250 to 300 pounds based on its construction. That meant even opening and closing it required significant effort. Why create that inconvenience when a standard door with a simple bar lock would protect supplies adequately? Cole Stark stopped by in February and made similar observations. The metal reinforcement alone represented 2 months' worth of pelt income. The time invested in construction could have been spent running additional trap lines. What practical benefit justified that investment? Reese's main cabin was well built by normal standards. The heavy door appeared to protect a storage space he could have built with standard methods for a fraction of the cost and effort. Reese did not reveal the hidden room or explain the thermal engineering principles he had designed into the system. He simply said he preferred building things properly. The other trappers thought he was obsessive and wasteful, but they accepted that some men had peculiar priorities. January of 1861 brought weather that old trappers would talk about for the rest of their lives. A cold front moved down from Canada with unprecedented severity. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero in some valleys. Wind speeds reached levels that made standing upright nearly impossible. The storm that became known as the Blizzard of '61 began on January 12th and lasted 5 full days without pause. Reese saw it coming. The sky took on a peculiar white quality the day before the storm hit. Animals behaved strangely. Birds that normally stayed through winter disappeared entirely. The air itself felt different, carrying a cold that penetrated through layers of clothing even before the wind arrived. He spent January 11th preparing. He brought his main cabin firewood supply inside. He secured everything outside that could blow away. He filled every container with water. Then he stocked the hidden room with final provisions, opened the heavy door with its concealed interior shelves, and carried in additional supplies he might need for an extended stay. The storm hit that night with fury that exceeded anything Reese had experienced in 7 winters. Wind screamed across the mountainside with force that shook the cabin's log walls. Snow came horizontally rather than falling, driven by winds that found every tiny gap in the chinking. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the interior walls, despite the fire Reese maintained in the central pit. By the second day, Reese realized the main cabin was becoming uninhabitable. He could not keep the fire burning adequately because wind gusts created downdrafts in the chimney that either smothered the flames or blew smoke back into the living space. The temperature inside dropped steadily, despite his burning wood, at unsustainable rates. His hands began going numb, even wearing gloves near the fire. He made the decision on the afternoon of January 13th. He gathered his remaining essential supplies, opened the heavy door that appeared to be simple storage, and retreated into the putti, 8x8 refuge he had built. He pulled the door closed behind him, feeling it seal against the frame with the weight of 300 pounds pressing inward. The shelves on the interior door face, loaded with wool blankets and provisions, created layers of insulation between him and the freezing main cabin. The horizontal locking beam slid into place, connecting the door to the wall structure. Inside the hidden room, the change was immediate and dramatic. The howling wind became muffled, distant. The temperature held steady at 48 degrees without any fire at all. Reese lit a small fire in the corner pit, no larger than what he would use to cook a meal. Within an hour, the temperature climbed to 60 degrees. The packed earth floor radiated stored warmth. The earth-backed walls blocked all drafts. The room felt almost comfortable. Outside, the blizzard screamed with winds that were killing men across the territory. Inside his hidden refuge, Reese sat in relative comfort, knowing he had firewood for weeks, food hanging overhead, water stored in jars, and a space so well engineered that survival required almost no effort at all. Reese emerged from the hidden room on January 18th, 5 days after retreating inside. The blizzard had finally passed during the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow and a silence that felt unnatural after days of screaming wind. The main cabin was freezing, with frost coating every interior surface. The fire pit held only cold ashes, but Reese himself was healthy, well-fed, and had burned through less than 1/5 of the firewood he had stored in the refuge. He spent the morning clearing snow from around his cabin and checking the surrounding area for damage. By midday, he saw movement on the trail below. Jude Flint was struggling through the deep snow, moving slowly and awkwardly. When he reached Reese's cabin, his condition was immediately apparent. Jude's face showed signs of severe exposure. His hands were wrapped in cloth. He was shaking uncontrollably despite wearing every piece of clothing he owned. Jude's story came out in fragments as Reese brought him inside and started a fire. The blizzard had caught him unprepared. His cabin's standard construction had proven completely inadequate against the extreme cold. Wind had penetrated every gap in the chinking. The chimney had become unusable due to downdrafts. By the second day, Jude had been forced to burn everything combustible just to maintain barely survivable temperatures. He had burned his furniture, his extra trap handles, even some of the floorboards. He had stayed alive, but just barely. Cole Stark arrived 3 hours later in similar condition. He had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite. The tips had turned black during the storm's 3rd day, when his firewood supply had run critically low. He had been forced to choose between keeping his cabin marginally warm or losing digits to the cold. He had made the calculation that fingers were replaceable, but freezing to death was permanent. 2 other trappers from the wider region did not survive. Word came later that week. Marcus Webb had frozen to death on the storm's 4th night when his fire went out, and he lacked the strength to relight it. Another man, whose name Reese never learned, had been found dead in his cabin, surrounded by ashes where he had burned everything available and still lost the battle against the cold. The survivors wanted answers. How had Reese come through the worst blizzard in memory looking healthy and well-rested? His firewood supply outside the cabin appeared largely untouched. He showed no signs of exposure or frostbite. He had clearly not suffered the way every other man in the territory had suffered. Reese considered his options carefully. He could deflect the questions and keep his innovation private. But looking at Jude's wrapped hands and Cole's blackened fingers, he understood that knowledge should be shared when it could save lives. He walked to what appeared to be a heavy but ordinary wooden door. He gripped the metal reinforcement plate and pulled. The door swung open, revealing the shelves built into its interior face, loaded with blankets and provisions. Beyond those shelves, warm amber light spilled from the hidden 8x8 room. Jude and Cole stared in complete silence, understanding dawning slowly as they realized what they were seeing. Beck Thorne built the first replica in the spring of 1861. He had not survived the blizzard in his own territory 20 miles east, but he had heard the stories from Jude Flint about the hidden room and the door that was not what it appeared to be. Beck traveled to Reese's cabin in March and asked to see the system for himself. Reese showed him everything: the earth-backed construction, the packed floor, the heavy door with shelves built into the interior face, the metal reinforcement, the compression seal created by loaded provisions, the small volume designed for thermal efficiency. Beck spent 2 days examining every detail and asking questions about the engineering principles. He understood immediately what Reese had accomplished. This was not just a hidden room. It was a complete thermal refuge system where every component served multiple purposes. The door provided access, storage, insulation, and concealment simultaneously. The room provided shelter, but more importantly, it provided survivable temperature with minimal resource expenditure. Within 2 years, a dozen trappers across the northern Rockies had built similar systems. The construction details varied based on available materials and individual skill levels, but the core principles remained consistent. Small earth-backed rooms, heavy doors with concealed interior storage, integration of provisions into the thermal barrier system, and designs that appeared ordinary from the main living space while hiding sophisticated engineering behind that plain. Exterior. The innovation became known as the Thorne Door, named after Beck rather than Reese, following the frontier pattern where techniques were often credited to prominent adopters rather than original inventors. Reese never corrected the attribution. He had not developed the system for recognition. He had built it to survive after watching Knox Dane die and realizing that standard mountain cabins offered no real protection. The system spread slowly but steadily through the trapping community, and later to homesteaders who moved into the territories during the 1860s and 70s. Survival rates during harsh winters improved measurably in areas where the Thorne Door design was adopted. The technique proved valuable not just for blizzard survival, but also for security against human threats. Raiders and thieves saw ordinary cabins with plain doors, never realizing that refuges existed behind those unremarkable wooden panels. Reese left the mountains in 1865. The fur trade had collapsed completely by then. Beaver felt had been replaced by silk in hat production, destroying the market that had brought mountain men west in the first place. He took his savings and purchased a small ranch in the Oregon Territory, in a valley west of the Cascade Mountains, where winters were mild and grizzly bears were not a constant threat. He married in 1867. His wife was a widow with 2 children from her first marriage. They had 3 more children together over the following years. Reese worked his ranch, raised his family, and lived quietly. He never spoke much about his years in the mountains. His children knew he had been a trapper once, but he told them no stories about building hidden rooms or surviving impossible blizzards.